I would like to welcome Louise Perry here, even if not personally, but virtually and online. And first of all, I'm very sorry that your illness actually couldn't let you come to Hungary, but at the same time, I'm very happy that you could join us, even despite your illness. Just in some sentences, Louise Perry is a journalist, a columnist, the author of the book The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which became a bestseller in the UK very quickly. And first of all, Louise is going to give an introduction presentation, and then after her speech, we are going to have a discussion about the questions that rose during her speech and the questions that I have collected while reading her book. Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Funnily enough, the reason that I can't be with you all today in Budapest is closely linked to the subject that I wanted to open by talking about, which is the nature of biological sex differences and the nature of natural limits. I am told I have maternal pneumonia, which I've had for a couple of weeks, which is a respiratory illness that particularly affects pregnant women. I'm 5 months pregnant, partly because the pregnant immune system is suppressed, and partly because pregnant lungs are under extra pressure. And so it's very much the case that I can't be with you today because I'm a woman, right? And because I'm experiencing this uniquely female thing, which is bearing children. I've heard it said by a friend of mine that Mother Nature is the biggest misogynist. And in many ways, what feminism, certainly liberal feminism, which is the subject of today's discussion, takes aim at is, in a sense, Mother Nature. It is, in a sense, about flexing against the limits imposed on us by our bodies, by our minds, by the world around us, to try and achieve maximal freedom for women in particular. And I think it's useful to think of it as, to use the term liberal feminism, even though most liberal feminists don't describe themselves as such, because it is, in that sense, the feminist iteration of liberalism. You know, liberalism for good and ill. I am, in the end, a liberal myself, but the liberal project is all about maximizing the freedom of the individual and all about flexing against natural limits. And I think what we're learning, and what I'm going to speak about today, is the extent to which the liberal project, the liberal feminist project, cannot help but end up undermining itself because of some inherent problems within the ideology. So what is the predicament that men and women, or women in particular, face as a consequence of our natural differences? Whatever some activists might like to tell you, the only people who can get pregnant are women. Every single person who's ever lived was born, started life in the body of a woman. Women suffer the pain and difficulty and danger of childbirth and nursing, much more dangerous in the pre-modern era. Women are also significantly smaller and weaker than men in terms of our upper body strength. Men are twice as strong as we are. They can punch twice as hard as we can. There are certain asymmetries between the sexes. Those are just the physical ones. There are psychological ones too, which are so profoundly important in terms of understanding the relationship between the sexes. And there's also, at best, there is also a sort of easy complementarity between the sexes. You know, yes, women are more physically vulnerable than men, but then traditionally men are expected to put the safety of women and children first. You know, famously on the Titanic, women and children boarded the lifeboats first. Most of the people who died on the Titanic sinking were men. What we now is rather unfashionable, but is historically described as chivalry, behaving like a gentleman, is all about kind of ameliorating these differences between the sexes. And I think that there is a sort of, at best, in traditional gender roles, there is a sort of pact between men and women. We have our privileges, we have our responsibilities as well. So for men, the privilege of being male means that you get to be head of the household, you get to have a certain status, you get to have the ability to participate in public life. Obviously, all of this is affected by one's class position, but these are things that traditionally only are available to men. The downside is that you have to provide for your wife and children. You have to, in extremis, give your life, protecting your family and your community. Women have their own symmetrical sets of privileges and responsibilities, right? So the privileges for women traditionally are we are the recipients of chivalrous behavior. We are given physical accommodations that men are not given. We're treated more gently. The responsibilities are that we have to bear and raise children and to do the often very difficult job of being in the home. These are ideals, right? And what both sexes do, what you see not only in feminism but also in men's rights activism, which is its a counterpart, is both sexes flex against the responsibilities. They say, no, we just want to have the privileges. We just want to have the good bits. We don't want to have the bad bits that come with the traditional male and female roles. The thing that has really changed those roles over the last, particularly since the invention of the pill, so in the 1960s, but really earlier than that, going back to the 19th century, really, is technology, is the fact that we've seen this enormous change in the structures of modern life as a consequence of a whole host of technologies that have all built on top of each other. So the pill is one very important example, but so is the washing machine. Phyllis Schlafly, American anti-feminist campaigner, who some of you might be familiar with, she famously said that the washing machine did more to liberate women than feminism ever did. I would say that in some sense, the washing machine produced feminism, in that those kinds of domestic technologies are things that allow women to much more quickly and easily keep a household warm, clothed, and fed. Were the technologies that permitted women to start participating in public life, that permitted women to have the time, to have the leisure time to go to meetings, to be involved in political campaigning. We see this from the 19th century. It's the generation of affluence, post-industrial revolution, and technology down the line that creates this whole feminist project. It's not as they've, this is, in some sense, this is why, this is one of the key reasons in which I'm a conservative, in that I don't think that our ancestors were bad and stupid, necessarily. Some of them were, I'm sure. But the idea that feminism came along in sometime within the last 200 years and accelerated in the last 50, because no one before then had ever thought about it. No one before then had ever thought that, domestic violence was bad, that the lower status of women was in some sense unjust. I think is very foolish. I think that what was going on is that our ancestors were dealing with an extraordinarily different set of material circumstances than the ones that we are dealing with. And the different material circumstances that we are dealing with have encouraged a renegotiation of gender roles, for good and ill. I don't think that I describe myself as a feminist. I would say that I'm a conservative feminist, right? I think that there are some elements of feminist campaigning that are good and necessary, and particularly those in relation to violence against women and against children, which has been the subject of my adult life's work, really. Before I became a journalist, I worked at a rape crisis centre, working with women who've been victims of sexual violence. That's the big cost of the traditional gender role setup, the setup where you have the man as the head of the household and the woman in a legally subservient position. What does that woman do when her husband beats and rapes her? This is like the great question to which we have not actually really found an answer. But feminists have tried very hard to find answers in the forms of rape crisis shelters and reforms to the legal systems and so on, which is all to the good. So I don't reject any of that. The thing that I am wary of in the liberal feminist project, so the project that is orientated towards maximizing individual freedom, is the extent to which it the extent to which it cannot cope with human nature, that kind of ideology. My friend Mary Harrington, who I think is speaking to you tomorrow, she's coined this term reactionary feminism, which is kind of a joke, right? But it's catchy all the same, to describe her view on these matters and my view on these matters, because we're very much in sync on this. And reactionary feminism, in some sense, has a very tragic outlook on the world. It says that the predicament that men and women find ourselves in, where we have these often complementary, sometimes intention, that the differences between us, psychological and physical, that predicament is not going away. That predicament can to some extent be hidden. So the pill, for instance, sort of hides it, right? If women can suspend their fertility, if women can become sort of artificially sterile young women who can turn their fertility on and off, to some extent you can operate in the world as if you were a man. You can delay childbearing or forgo childbearing entirely in order to prioritize your career. You can have casual sex without having to fear an unwanted pregnancy. You can kind of smooth over that essential difference, that essential asymmetry between the sexes. The same is also true to some extent of our modern working practices, where many people in modern societies do not do manual labor. We don't do the kind of work that really highlights the advantage in male strength that men have. Pre-industrial revolution, male muscle power had enormous economic power. And one consequence of the internal combustion engine, amongst else, is that male muscle power has less economic power than it used to. Men and women can participate in the labour market on a much more equal footing than they ever could before. These are ways in which we can sort of pretend that the differences between us are not so very important after all. Normally, that pretense vanishes very quickly as soon as a woman becomes a mother for the first time and realizes that actually her role is so utterly different from the role of her husband or partner. But until that point, and of course, many women are now not having children or having children much later in life, until that point, it is possible to pretend that actually these natural differences between us don't matter. And liberal feminism pushes for more and more. It says, there should be, in its most extreme manifestation, it says that the biological sexes don't actually exist. That you can self-identify as whatever you like. The idea that we have these two distinct sex classes is just old-fashioned nonsense, and that there's a push to utilize more and more technology and more of the consumer market to hide those differences even further. The surrogacy industry is one example of that, where the surrogacy industry promises women you don't even have to get pregnant. You can use your eggs. You can put them into the body of a willing surrogate. You can have it all, baby. That's the promise. The problem is that again, it's a fundamentally conservative vision, a fundamentally conservative recognition that everything comes with trade-offs. And this progressive vision of history is in its most extreme manifestation as a utopian vision of history. It says that we can be absolutely free. We can forget our meaty selves. We can forget the bodies that we were born with. We can transform ourselves through technology, through our own force of will. I think that utopian vision is potentially very dangerous in the way that utopian visions always are. And I also think that in practical terms, even when we have proved capable of hiding some of our sex differences, our physical sex differences, we still essentially have Stone Age minds. Our minds are not really any different from those of our 19th century ancestors, our first century ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors. The human brain takes a very long time to change. It's much, much slower to change than are our material circumstances, which we've been able to change through technology. And so, an example that I emphasize in my first book is the differences in sexuality between men and women, the fact that, yes, women can have sex like men, right? Women can have casual sex and with modern contraception not fear pregnancy. But for most women, doing so is actually not really in their nature. It actually goes against there are, of course, exceptions, these average differences, but at the population level, psychologically, women and men are quite profoundly different when it comes to sexuality. Women much prefer monogamy. Women want to know and have a emotional connection with someone before they have a sexual relationship. You know, these are instincts that have evolved over a human history, because for 99.999% of human history, we didn't have the pill, right? And having sex is probably one of the most consequential decisions a woman can make in an environment where pregnancy is a likely outcome of having sex during her fertile years. So these are the sort of limits where you try as you might, and lots of liberal feminists are trying really hard and encouraging other women to do the same. Try as you might, you cannot actually overcome your own nature and the natures of men and women writ large. And I mean, one of the subject of my next book, which has been somewhat hindered by the fact that I'm actually walking the walk on this, but the subject of my next book is on motherhood, and birth rates, and the fact that modern peoples seem to be incapable, whether it be in Hungary, in Britain, in South Korea, in Argentina, all across the world. Modern people seem to be very averse to having children. It's something that you see across every country as soon as they hit a certain level of affluence. The only country in the world for whom this is not true is Israel. Israel has some quite unusual circumstances which make it an exception, but in general, as soon as a country becomes affluent and modern and enjoys all of the technology we've been talking about today, the pill, the washing machine, all the rest of it, excuse me, people become disinclined to have children and birth rates start falling. And one of the consequences of this, which is on the very near horizon, is that these countries are going to start shrinking very rapidly. The nature of geometric progressions is that if you have a very low birth rate, your population doesn't fall in a linear way. Your population falls exponentially, right? And so the big question that I'm trying to engage with in this book, while also having my second baby, is, does that mean that modernity is in a sense self-limiting? Does that mean that we actually can't have it all? We actually can't have all of if we can't find a way to be both modern and fertile, if we can't find a way to honor and promote motherhood, crucially, something that liberal feminism has never managed to do. Liberal feminism always struggles with motherhood, because the nature of motherhood is that mothers and babies are not individuals. Not really. And unless we can find a way of having all the good bits of feminism and also honoring motherhood and promoting a fertile culture, then, you know, this is the paradox of liberal feminism. Liberal feminism is going to kill itself. Essentially, it is a self-limiting ideology in that sense.
Thank you very much, Louise. And if you allow me just a personal note, when I first had your book in my hand and I started to flip through the pages, and I found chapter titles like "Men and Women Are Different," like "Human Beings Are Not Products," like "Violence is Not Love." And I just had this idea of seeing these titles through the eyes of my parents or grandparents, and probably they wouldn't even understand these sentences, not because it's very far from them, because it is so very obvious that they wouldn't understand why they have to be written down. So the first question is how it happened, how all these big changes happened in such a short period of time, even though washing machine has been around for longer than all these changes have happened. Why now? Why so quickly? Why us? Why here? Because if you think of some other parts of the world, these things are still very obvious.
Yeah, I think the answer is technology, but it's not as though ideology is irrelevant. I think it's more that technology and ideology have this dialectical relationship, and so it's the washing machine. I think the pill is a really big one. The pill is the technology that really upends sexual relationships and means that one effect. I don't know if you have this expression in Hungary, the shotgun wedding. The shotgun wedding was gone within about 5 years of the pill being legalized for unmarried women in most countries. It happened at about the same time across most countries. It really upended sexual relationships very quickly. And I think probably what's going on for some of the young people nowadays who hold some radical views and who find my chapter titles grossly offensive, right, is that they've never lived in a world where that's not true. And the idea of sex being extraordinarily consequential and of sexual asymmetry being a fact of life is just not something that would necessarily occur to them because it has never really been a feature of their lives. I mean, of course, in practice it is. Even very reliable contraception has a failure rate. Quite a lot of women will end up having abortions because contraception has failed. To some extent, the availability of abortion pushes this out of sight and allows us to pretend, because most women don't shout about their abortions, right? Allows us to pretend that casual sex is consequence-free, when of course it isn't. But I think that this generation who's never really had to think about what the first feminists had to think about. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft, who's often credited as being the mother of feminism, British philosopher in the early 19th century, so much of her writing in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman is about exactly this question, is about this issue of the sexual asymmetry and the vulnerability of women to pregnancy. She, of course, ended up dying after she gave birth to her daughter. These are essential questions that early feminists grappled with and which younger feminists have forgotten. And I think that's probably a big part of the reason why some of these essential truths are not being spoken about now as they ought to be.
Unfortunately, you can't see the audience. I can. And there are a lot of young ladies, a lot of young women here in the audience. And we hear very often that, well, actually, you were born, I'm sorry, not you, maybe you as well, but you definitely were born in an age when you talked about technology, Louise, and when social media is just something very obvious. I mean, I still remember the word when there was no Instagram and Facebook and all the rest and TikTok, but many young people didn't even live at that time. And the question is that sometimes the life that we see on social media, when everybody is happy, everybody is perfect, everybody is just like no flaws at all, nothing. So there is this perfect world, and then there is reality. When people are sometimes unhappy, when sometimes we have freckles, when sometimes we are just ugly, and it's normal. Why is it that this unreal world is so much stronger than the real world? Why?
Yeah, this is one of the features of the digital revolution, which is very psychologically profound. People, in some senses, living their real, the expression IRL, in real life, is always kind of interesting to me because it means offline, but online is real life as well. And many people actually, well, not many, some people find their online lives to be more vivid than the offline ones. And I mean, I can't help but be quite reactionary about this and think that this is very bad. I mean, I make a living on the internet. I can be with you now because of the internet. It's wonderful in some senses, but I think certainly there is good evidence. Jonathan Haidt's, American psychologist, is one leading voice on this question. There's good evidence that the quite sharp decline in the mental health of teenage girls over the last 10 to 15 years is a direct consequence of the rise of Instagram, in particular, the rise of social media that is image-based. One of the reasons I suspect this is true is because normally when you're assessing yourself, right, as a teenage girl, and you're very concerned about social status and about beauty and about your sexual market value, right, you will compare yourself only to the other girls in your social circle, who are a representative, normal, not airbrushed, any of this. And that's an easier pool, right, in which to assess yourself. Whereas when you go onto Instagram, you're instantly bombarded with images of the most beautiful women in the world, and they're airbrushed, and they're wearing heaps of makeup and so on. So I think that phenomenon can't help but make young women miserable. And I think that there isn't a solution to that except to log off. I don't think I'm certainly going to do everything I can to try and stop my children from using these platforms. I sort of suspect actually that the internet native generation, so I'm 32 now, so my generation, a bit younger, who grew up on the internet, are probably going to be stricter parents on this front, because I think that we are more alert to the dangers of the internet than our parents were, because they weren't really familiar with it at all. So I'm hoping that there will be there will be social solutions found to these technological problems.
So maybe young ladies and gentlemen who are sitting here in the audience, maybe they will be much more skillful than we are as parents when dealing, with how to help our kids with the internet. You talked a lot about feminism, and I asked a couple of my friends about what they think about feminism right now, and they couldn't really answer very properly, because it seems that in an age when it's very difficult to talk about questions like men, women, binary, non-binary, and all the rest, when you start to think about women in general, it may be a bit confusing. So what does feminism mean right now in the 21st century, in 2024?
I think in practice it often means well, okay, so I think what it means is displeasure with the women's lower social status compared with men. It can mean lots of things, right? And the strict sense in which I like to use it, and which I would call myself feminist according to this metric, is that there are certain ways in which women are made physically vulnerable by Mother Nature being a misogynist. And feminism is the political movement that seeks to remedy those, so that it offers women maternity leave so that they can have their children without losing their jobs, so that offers domestic violence shelters and rape crisis services for women who've been victims of male violence. That's the sort of feminism I work towards in practical terms. I think the way that it is often used, though, really in practice, is as a I did my first degree in anthropology, and one of the puzzles that anthropologists have often turned their attention towards is why women seem to be so consistently lower status across time and place. It's very, very consistent in cultures for women to be given second-class status in some manner, so to not have access to political decision making, to in some cultures to be made like physically, it's clear, like the women eat separately, the women sit lower, things like that, right? Why is this sort of eternal fact? And I think the answer to it is not misogyny. I don't want to call that misogyny. I don't think that's the right term, because it's not that women are hated. Obviously, there are sometimes misogynists, they exist at an individual level, but it's not that women are hated. It's more that women are regarded as childlike. I think what it is that probably deep within the human brain, there's this assessment that you've got men at the top of the status hierarchy, holding all else equal, holding socioeconomics equal, but you've got men at the top of status hierarchy, you've got children, and you've got women somewhere in the middle. And the thing is with children, we don't hate children, right? Like the mistreatment of children, or the mistreatment is the wrong word, the lower status afforded to children is not by virtue of us hating them, the fact that they're not allowed to vote, they're not allowed to have jobs, they're not allowed to have drive cars. It's that all things that women can't do in countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, right? It's that we regard them as being fundamentally different from adults. And I think traditionally that's the way that women are regarded as well. Somewhere in the middle between men and children are to be found women. And there are some advantages to women from having that status. We're not sent to war, for instance. We're not generally tasked with doing the heaviest manual labor. We're given some privileges alongside responsibilities and burdens. But I think particularly for women who may be quite psychologically more male, right, to be blunt about it, who might have to be more masculine in their temperaments, who are very ambitious professionally, who are very intelligent, women who have all of these qualities hate that. They hate the idea of having to assume this like quasi childlike social role. And I think that actually deep down, a lot of feminism is orientated towards that precise unhappiness. And it's also the reason why feminism has so often rejected, liberal feminism so often rejects motherhood, because motherhood seems to consign women even more to that child adjacent role, right? Not only are we smaller and weaker than men, just as children are, we're also associated with children by virtue of bearing and raising them. And so, yeah, I mean, I very much sympathize with the unhappiness, but I also think that there is a limit to how much we can really. I think that any kind of feminist project that aims to make women like men, exactly like men, is doomed to failure, because you just can't be. We will never be psychologically, physically. We will never be. And it seems like a fool's errand to try and change it. But unfortunately, I think, in answer to your question, that a lot of feminism has ended up howling at that particular moon.
You also mentioned several times conservative views and to be conservative. And though a lot of people try to have their 15 minutes of fame, but still when it gets to being conservative, or saying or identifying as conservative, many people just don't stand up saying that, yes, I'm conservative. Like, it is a little bit like as if they were ashamed of that. Is it really a shame to be conservative in the 21st century?
It's not very fashionable, is it? I mean, I would call myself a Burkean conservative after Edmund Burke, the English politician and philosopher, in the sense that I think that rapid change is dangerous. What I'm not is someone who wants to exactly replicate any previous era. So quite often, well, it's sort of a caricature of conservatives that they want to go back to the 1950s, that they want to, perhaps not in Hungary because of different political situation, but that they want to return to some, fairly recent decade. I don't think that we can do that, and I wouldn't want to. I'm a Burkean conservative in the sense that I think rapid change is very unwise, because there are always trade-offs. There are always unintended consequences. I think utopianism is a very dangerous psychological impulse. And I'm also, well, this is why Mary Harrington uses the term reactionary as a subtle alternative to conservatism, and in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. But what she means when she talks about reactionary is an effort to identify and recapture ancient truths, right? And this is one of the reasons I think that I find anthropology to be very useful as an academic discipline, because you can see before your own eyes when you study different cultures that there are lots of ways in which we all differ from one another. But there are also a lot of human universals. There have been various efforts over the years to list them, and they're from everything from belief in the supernatural to to warfare, to gender roles, right? Like, there are a lot of things that all cultures end up settling at, um, seemingly spontaneously, because they seem to be deeply rooted in human nature in some way. One of my favorite museums in the world is the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which is an anthropology museum, and it's very eccentrically arranged. It's like an old Victorian museum, so it's very unmodern. But one of the things that they do, which I think is very beautiful, is they group anthropological artifacts by theme, not by parts of the world or era. So you will go to a cabinet which contains like infant carriers, for instance, or bows and arrows, or types of boat, things like that. And you will see immediately that they are actually quite similar. That we've all of these cultures across time and place have ended up arriving at pretty much the same solutions to problems that all humans have faced. How do you carry babies? How do you navigate water, etc.? And I think that when I say reactionary, that's sort of what I mean. I mean looking deep into human history and to other parts of the world, not just to be parochial and think about 1950s America, right? And saying, so they have encountered all the same problems that we're encountering now. We probably have some new ones because we've invented like the internet, but basically they're encountering the same problems. And how have they come up with, what solutions have they come up with? And where are we diverging from all other peoples? That's the thing that I'm really interested in, because there are lots of ways in which modern Westerners are very strange. We do lots of very strange things. We're very anthropologically unusual because we have such unusual material circumstances. But I think that I think we're wrong to. So just one example, right? Most cultures, almost all cultures, have what's called in English a lying-in period. So it's a period after the mother's given birth, where she has a kind of a period of ritualized confinement in her home. So she remains at home, normally typically first in her bed and then in her bedroom and then in her home, and she's tended for by her female kin, so typically her mother and her sisters, and sometimes female servants, but mostly female relatives and friends, and they will do everything for her and they'll look after the baby and so on. And what's so interesting about the lying-in period is that pretty much every culture has it. They call it different things, but every culture has it, and it's about the same length of time. It's about 30 to 40 days everywhere, all across the world. Everyone has come up with about 30 to 40 days of ritualized confinement, except us, except us, right? Like I mean, when I gave birth the first time, I was in hospital for 1 day and then was sent home having had a cesarean section and was basically on my own. Well, you know, maybe with my husband, but that tradition of having everyone flocking all around, you know, it was just absent. I mean, partly because my family are Australians, they were all on the other side of the world, but that cultural template is just lost. And I think the reason we've lost it is because maternal mortality and infant mortality is now so much lower, because we have antibiotics, because we have sanitation. It's not as dangerous a period as it was for our ancestors. And so we've kind of thrown all the ritualized practices out the window and been like, oh, we don't need this. It's like, yeah, we don't need it in the sense of saving a mother's life or a baby's life. I mean, I, for instance, got an infection during what would have been my lying-in period, and I took antibiotics, and so it was fine. I might, in other circumstances, have died. So we throw these things out the window because we think we're modern, we don't need this. But I think actually the vast majority of new mothers would love to have a lying-in period and would love to have that that support in the early days of motherhood. And this is just one example where I think maybe we're wrong. If everyone else is doing it except us, maybe we're wrong. Maybe we could learn something from the past and from other cultures rather than being so hubristic.
Right. I'm afraid that our time has come to an end, but I would like to offer the floor, or the microphone rather, to anybody who has a question. You won't be able to see them, but you will be able to hear them. Do you have any questions? Not right now. So, Louise, we would like to thank you for joining us, despite all the difficulties that you have. And I think we will remember a lot of things about the Stone Age brain that we have, and all the other important things. Thank you very much for having joined us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll be virtually.
Thank you. Nagyon szépen köszönöm, hogy itt voltak, és hogy ilyen türelmesen meghallgatták ezt a féloldalas beszélgetést. Köszönöm.